Dr. Shashi Tharoor, welcome once again. You obviously don't need any introduction, but just for the pride I will take in being able to introduce, let me go ahead and make a short introduction. Dr. Shashi Tharoor is a third-term member of the parliament at Thiruvananthapuram. He's the best-selling author of over 20 books, both fiction and non-fiction, besides being former Undersecretary General of the United States and a former Minister of State for HRD, as well as External Affairs for the Government of India. He has won numerous awards, including the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2019, Dr. Tharoor was also awarded the Sahitya Academy Award in the category of English Nonfiction for his book An Era of Darkness. He chairs Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology and has recently released his latest book, The Battle of Belonging. Dr. Tharoor, welcome once again to the 10th alumni reunion of the Young India Fellowship at Ashoka and the first of Ashoka. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us as we complete nearly a decade of learning and unlearning. I know the audience has been waiting for this time for you, so I'm going to jump straight into it. The next 1 hour is very interestingly and aptly titled by Akriti as Unlearn with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. So let me start this conversation there. Please tell us something that you learned or unlearned about yourself in the past year that has been a rather unique 2020.
I was going to try and answer that when you began the question by talking about some of the things I've learned and unlearned having come into politics. But since you ask about 2020, I would say that in some ways I've realized, which I probably didn't need realizing because I've been a sort of work magnet ever since I was a kid, that what could and should perhaps have been a relatively tranquil period in my life has turned out to be busier than ever. And so what I've learned really is there seems to be no escaping from the onerous demands that come in an era of virtual communications, because at least in the old days when I thought I was overprogrammed and overstretched and overtired, I couldn't deliver a speech in Hyderabad on the same day that I could deliver it in Pune, and so I could say no to one of the invitations. But in 2020, you could do 5 of them organized by people in 5 different cities on the same day, and the excuse that you were somewhere else no longer applied. So I ended up delivering probably more speeches in 2020 than in the preceding 5 years, which is not necessarily a good thing because you find yourself to some degree repeating yourselves, and sometimes just tired of hearing yourself speak. But when Rudrangshu, my good friend, invited me to be part of your first alumni day, I couldn't say no. So another thing I've learned about myself is that I don't say no enough, perhaps. But anyway, I'm very pleased to be with all of you. And Ashoka has done such remarkable work in turning out a new kind of Indian undergraduate. Really, this is something which I'm very pleased about because I've been a long and somewhat ignored advocate of liberal education in the classic sense. And I do think that Ashoka exemplifies it in a way that very few institutions still do, in an era where everyone wants to be a scientist or a doctor or an engineer, or worst of all, a computer specialist. So good to be with all of you Ashoka students and alums today.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. You mentioned you wanted to also reflect on your political career and what you unlearned. I don't want to miss that opportunity at all. So why don't you go ahead and tell us what have you learned or unlearned about your political career? And also, like Dr. Rudanshu said, we don't want to pigeonhole you into being a politician. So in your life, what have you learned? And
oh God, that would take up far too long. Let me try and give you sort of headline answers on the first thing. I mean, I think the first thing I learned when I came into Indian politics was that I could do it at all. When I said yes to being invited to contest for a Lok Sabha seat, I had really no idea what I was getting into. And it turned out to be the hardest thing I'd ever done. And I believe me, I've been to a few hard situations, served the United Nations in wars while they were raging, dealt with numerous member states around the world. But coming into a Lok Sabha campaign in the hottest month of the year and discovering that 18-hour days could stretch into 23-hour days and yet to be up with a smile on your face and ready to campaign the next day, and that very many people on your own side were also trying to get you down, that was quite an experience. And I have to say that I think the first discovery, the first learning was that I could do it at all. And I think many people who come from a sort of typical middle class, educated, urban, professional background, as I did, will know what I'm talking about, because it really isn't something that you know you can do until you try and do it. And the second thing I learned is when various people went after me after my triumph in the elections, and I suffered more than the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that normally come in your first year of anything. I mean, I don't know whether Ashoka suffers from Delhi University's ailment of ragging, but we're all used to being ragged in the first few months of a new task. But I was ragged for about a year, and I ended up resigning from the government after a series of unfounded accusations. It looked as if anything I said, anything I did could be twisted maliciously and turned against me. And that was first of all, a learning experience that could happen. And then a learning experience to know that I could, in the end, survive, deal with it. Many people expected me to just quit in disgust and leave Indian politics altogether and leave India altogether. But I felt that I had made a very difficult, very major decision to give up a lot of things in my previous life, to return to India and commit myself to working at the Indian ground level. And I was determined to at least be loyal to my own judgment. And taking one thing at a stride, I was able to, one thing at a time, and taking the adversities in stride, I was able to turn that lemon into lemonade by leaving the foreign ministry, which I was thoroughly enjoying myself at. I found myself being able to become a good constituency MP, which is not something that would have otherwise come naturally to me. And that again, I think, and then my return to government was a vindication of sorts. And then I suppose the third hardest learning in politics came around the time of the death of my late wife, when the most incredible to me, I mean, unbelievably incredible accusations were made and were given currency by certain opportunistic television anchors. And it seems that even the authorities, the police, could not move away from the atmosphere that had been created. And again, to be able to deal with that is something you don't know you can do until you actually have to. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But, I'm standing 6 years later, while the tortuous and torturous processes of justice wend their way forward through the court system. I've learned a lot about resilience, about being true to yourself, and about the great strength that a clear conscience gives you. I mean, I will say that it's very clear that public life involves exposure to a lot of unfounded accusations that many people have to go through. Some of the veteran politicians just say, well, this is par for the course. I didn't come from that background. I wasn't prepared for any of this. I certainly wasn't expecting the kinds of things that I had to go through. But I think at the end, that sort of thick skin that you develop and that inner resilience is so important for whatever you do in life, that it became a useful learning from the adversities of politics. So I would say those are the things. Now, there are more trivial learnings in the political thing about how what you say doesn't matter. It's what people hear that matters. So that don't say your own good intentions are never a good enough excuse, because in fact, as long as what you said can be twisted or misrepresented to mean something else, then that's all that matters. It doesn't mean what you intended to say. That's a useful learning for people in public spaces. And I learned it with things like cattle class, which to this day is cited against me, even though the phrase, well precedes me, doesn't mean what the critics say it meant, and was used by the person who asked me the question, Mr. Minister, will you travel in cattle class? So all of those things are forgotten. And even as recently as an event yesterday, a BJP supporter said, Mr. Tharoor disparages our message as cattle class. And I said, no, it's an expression used to disparage the airlines for herding us in like cattle. The expression is 30 years old. I didn't invent it. I didn't call our people cattle. But, I can go till I'm blue in the face. That is now stuck as a new received wisdom. So always be careful what you say. It's a sad maxim because I'm somebody who relishes words, enjoys the beauty, the magic, the humor that words make possible. And I've had to curb a lot of my instincts. And that's probably the final superficial learning, is that sometimes you have to curb your enthusiasm if you want to survive in the contemporary world. So that's just a few lessons at random. We can explore some of them more deeply if you want, but that's roughly the big and the small of it.
Well, that sounds as enriching as tough as a listener. So seeing you on the other side of the table is just very heartening. I do want to pick on one theme that you mentioned, which will resonate with the audiences attending this session, is how a person from an urban, educated, middle class transitioned into politics. And as we read your career, also you've been an academic at Fletcher, then you were a career professional at the UN. So you've really spent a lot of time building your intellectual capital before you went on to build your social capital for politics, which is very unusual for Indian politics. As a lot of people who are audiences into this session from a similar background, urban, middle class, educated, no dynasty in politics, want to enter to service the country, some of the events that you mentioned are events, but as a strategic thinking, and if you don't want a lot of people to be leaving and never returning, then what are some of the things that you think will be helpful for people before entering the politics to work on?
Well, there's so many different answers to that question, Jayeshta, because it depends, first of all, when you speak of entering politics, what kind of politics. If you're looking at elective office, running for a state assembly or running for the national parliament, that requires in many ways a different set of skills, from being a kind of respected thinker in a party and getting a Rajya Sabha seat or something like that, uh, where you don't have to be daily responsive to the, frankly, very often trivial demands of your voters. And I would have to say that you're right that I spent a lot of my life in trying to juggle, if you like, the world of conclusions and the world of decisions. The conclusions are the intellectual conclusions you come to from discussing an issue, analyzing it, studying it, reading about it, and understanding it intellectually. And the decisions are usually decisions you take in the policy arena when you've understood the issue, but you've also had to understand the dimensions, first, of its impact on people, second, of the way it is perceived by others, and third, of the political consequences, none of which are relevant to a purely intellectual analysis. So juggling the two, even, for example, in my UN career, I was writing all the time in my own time, but I didn't write very much. I will explain in a minute what the exception was, but I didn't write very much to do with my work. I wrote a lot about India. My books were all about India because that was safe ground for an Indian citizen working at the UN, since anything else I wrote about could potentially have caused me trouble with other member states. Being a citizen of a democracy, I could write books about India and particularly write fiction without being troubled in that area. But what I did do in terms of giving myself some intellectual satisfaction from my work was writing a few scholarly journal articles on things I was interested in about the UN's work. And there were essentially two areas. One was peacekeeping, on which for a short while in the 90s, I would say less than a decade, I became a kind of recognized global authority because I was one of just 3 civilians, I beg your pardon, 5 civilians and 3 military when the peacekeeping staff were working at the end of the Cold War. And then we suddenly expanded dramatically when so many new peacekeeping operations were born that I kind of rose with it. And we went from being, as I said, 5 civilians and 3 military at headquarters to about 880 at headquarters and about 80,000 troops in the field. And it suddenly became a dramatic transformation. And I was somebody who was not only working in that process, making decisions, writing cables, writing policy notes, going to the Security Council and the Secretary General and so on all these issues, but I I also imagined, and people made me imagine, that I had the intellectual capital to try and make sense of it. So I wrote a number of articles in journals of political science and peacekeeping studies and that sort of thing. The journal Survival, published by the International Institute of Strategic Studies, some of the scholarly journals, and help define or try and give some shape to the concepts of peacekeeping and how they were being stretched and expanded during this period. And it was very much like a painting, shall we say, a moving vehicle. The situation was evolving even while I was analyzing and describing it. But that kind of intellectual satisfaction was available. And then when it came to one other area of interest in which I was not directly involved, but only indirectly, human rights. I did some writing on the then controversial question of whether human rights were universal or not. The Nordic Journal of International Law and World Politics Review and a couple of others have pieces from me on that theme. So those were the only areas really where intellectually I engaged with my work. Otherwise, I did my work on the one hand, and I wrote in my spare time or on flights or on weekends about India. That was it. Coming back to India and to Indian politics was an interesting challenge. Politics, or the stuff, the daily warp and woof of politics, is not, for the most part, intellectually satisfying. Constituents will come to you looking for jobs, for transfers, for placements for their children, for opportunities here and there, for loan interest to be waived, ultimately we have created a culture in our politics where things that in most Western democracies would be considered inappropriate and even unethical for a political representative to intervene in are actually the things that in India a political representative is expected to intervene. So it's so amusing when I write a letter to a State Bank of India saying so-and-so constituent of mine, you have transferred him to such and such place, but he has an aged mother and a dying father and a pregnant wife in such and such place, and can you transfer him to this place or transfer him back to his hometown, whatever it may be. Now, if I had done that as a Washington-based congressman, I would have been out of a job the moment that letter leaked. So you've got a very different set of assumptions in India, but in India, by not doing it, in fact, the famous story in Kerala politics is about the chief minister's constituent was going to Washington and wanted to have a meeting with President Bill Clinton and said, will you write me a letter to Bill Clinton introducing me and asking for him to meet me? Now, perhaps a more sensible, educated, professional person would have said, listen, this is not realistic. It doesn't work this way. My letter won't even reach the president. If at all you had an official person, a reason to see the president, you'll have to go through the Indian embassy and they may or may not decide to convey your request. There are procedures and so on. Instead of doing that, this chief minister friend of mine very wisely said, I don't care what the Americans who get my letter think about me. They let them think I'm an idiot if they want to. But my constituent must not go away feeling that I have not fulfilled his request. So he wrote a letter to Bill Clinton, gave a copy to the constituent, put the original in the post. And of course, the guy never got the appointment, but he left feeling my chief minister has done this for me. That's Indian politics, and that's something which you will not find intellectually satisfying with an Ashoka education, but which you may well find worth thinking about when you contemplate elective political life. So what I did was to find intellectual satisfaction out of the realm of politics. I started writing about the bigger picture of politics, having benefited from the internal experience of the grassroots, being a grassroots politician. And that's why I have produced a few books which have looked at politics as a few politicians have, in the sense that my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, is a study of Prime Minister Modi's first term, which I dare say came out faster than any academic study has done. And at the same time is informed by my own engagement with some of these debates. And my recent book, The Battle of Belonging, takes up some of the recent developments of Indian politics in terms of defining nationhood, in terms of describing critics and dissidents as anti-national and so on, and uses that as a peg to explore the entire question of what is nationalism conceptually, theoretically, and in practice around the world and in India, in our constitution and in our political practice. So it has been for me an intellectually satisfying experience to write it, but at the same time, it was something which I wrote because, or informed by, my passionate engagement with these debates as an opposition MP. And so you'll find your intellectual satisfaction. If you can't find it in your work, you can create it around your work.
That's a good response. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. I just want to quickly mention to the audiences, you can start pouring in your questions. We'll be opening the floor for questions in another 2 minutes. And I will ask you a pointed question, at least for in context of what you said. You worked with several young professionals, including from Ashoka University and the likes of us, so to say. In your observation, what are the strengths we can lean on, given our background, academic and social cultural background, for a successful political career or a successful policy career? And what are some of the weaknesses that we should be mindful of to start working on?
Okay, so the fact is, I'm very proud of my working relationship with a number of young people. The average age in my office in Delhi is actually just about 24. I take people right out of right out of their graduation very often, and a number of my close assistants have either had no prior full-time work experience or just a couple of years, and have come to me partly because I've seen in them the kinds of qualities that I believe I need to run my office, and partly because they want to gain the experience, which means I get top-notch professionals who will go on, I'm sure, to stellar careers, and one or two of whom already have, for far, far less than they deserve financially, because I can only afford to pay them, what I can make from my government salary and my writing royalties, neither of which is terribly high. But I managed so far to attract some very good talent, and I can tell you what their strengths are. Their strengths, first of all, are they have a brain. They've come out of a good education for the most part. And because they have a brain, they can quickly understand issues and deal with them, respond to them, analyze them, reply to letters and communications in a way that I can relate to and engage with, and as I expect from them. Secondly, I think they have an intellectual ability. You see, the typical aide to an Indian politician is a long-serving Delhi Sarkari type. And I don't mean to say this offensively. Some of them have a lot of smarts, but their greater strength is in knowing how things work and knowing other people like that than in any sort of intellectual grasp of the system. Whereas because I have people who perhaps don't know the government that well, but have the intellectual equipment to understand the issues, I get very useful support. I get quick research done for my speeches in Parliament. I get the kinds of analysis and writing done for me that the typical Sarkari Babu private secretary would not be able to do. And when you look at some of the people I've had working with me, I've had Manu Pillai, who's gone on to be a wonderfully respected popular historian, published 3 books already. I've had a former McKinsey employee called Yashashri Soman, who wanted to leave the world of management consulting and look into public policy, and she worked with me. I've had Raghav Sharma, who came to me from Deloitte, and as subsequently, after a couple of years of doing outstanding work, I realized he needed his salary in pounds sterling that he abandoned to come to me, so he's gone back to London. And now I have John Koshi, who started off as an intern right out of college, just did research for me, and then started writing draft speeches and things like that. And I found him so good, we kept him on full time, and then he moved into the sort of chief of staff slot that Raghav vacated. And he's only joined me with the intention of getting some experience before going on to graduate school himself. So all of these things suggest that young people bring qualities to my work and to my office that I'm very privileged to have. I mean, I'd be very happy if John stayed on, for example, longer than the graduate schools might want him to, because I actually feel that that I can afford to relax a little bit in my own level of work and preparation when I know I've got backup from a person of that quality. And that kind of thing is why I value with young people. Now, you ask what the weaknesses are. The first weakness is obviously insufficient life experience. That's something which partly I hope I can compensate for, because I feel I've probably had quite a lot of life experience for one lifetime, maybe more than one lifetime's worth. But the compensatory negative is that they don't have any experience of how the government system actually works. I do keep one retired Sarkari type person around in my office to be a fixer, the guy who knows who to call when there is an issue at the airport or at the railway station, or at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, or at a hospital or a clinic, or the parliament bureaucracy, or whatever. Somebody who knows who to call, what to do, how to get it done, who can go off and function in a local environment that many of these smart young graduates are not able to. So I do keep this person on, and that's where I find it possible to compensate for. And then finally, that is choices for public policy are ultimately largely dictated by politics. That is, by a calculation based on public needs and preferences and practical awareness of what is doable and acceptable. Now, that's something it's often unfair to demand from a 23, 24-year-old. But conversely, when I can say to a young person, listen, I have an invitation, for example, to go off and appear on such and such show, or to be interviewed by such and such comedian, or whatever, these are people who mean nothing to me in my daily life, but for them, they understand very quickly what the audience is for this kind of comedian, or for that kind of show, or this kind of website, whether it's worth doing, not doing. And I'm often following their judgment. So, it's actually my young staff who persuaded me to do that stand-up comedy on Amazon, which sort of in some ways added an unexpected dimension to my reputation in this country. But I trusted them because on 2 previous occasions, the same staff had said, don't do X comedian or X kind of format, because we've seen those shows and they would not be right for you. And when this came along, they said, this would work, this is worth doing. Show them, the funny side of your personality. So again, everyone's experience, everyone's judgment varies, and the judgment of the young people has its own value as well.
Thank you. What I'm hearing is we do bring brains, and I hope more and more political leaders are open to accepting that. And meanwhile, it'll do us good for success in the policy and political career, to develop a knowledge of the government systems, so that your reliance on the fixer also reduces over time. We have some questions coming in from the audience, and
Sure.
some of the repeating themes that are coming in is that in recent years we've seen an extreme polarization in the world, and has not served anybody well. So as people are making choices to engage with the government, whether as a citizen or as a professional, how much weightage should they give to the ideologies of the ruling government, versus the specific project or the specific work that they want to get engaged with?
Well, it's difficult, frankly, not to be aware. If you're an intelligent thinking person, as obviously all of you are, very difficult not to be aware of the ideology of the ruling government. Now, that is not to say that everything must always be seen through that prism, but many things can. It's very difficult to be objective about the Citizenship Amendment Act proposal without being conscious of the political agenda that undergirds it and the political implications of disqualifying just people of one particular religion from a fast track being made available to others. On the other hand, let's say something like a Swachh Bharat campaign. Cleanliness has no ideology, and it should be possible to execute a project like that professionally without thinking about the ideology of the government. So the answer to that question will depend on a case-to-case basis. But most of the big sort of policy things emerge from a certain view of the world that the government has, and it's difficult to avoid that. And many of the sort of relatively, shall we say, policy neutral things, things that can be explained or justified purely in terms of efficiencies, those things can be seen perhaps more easily without an ideological prism. But I would say for most decisions of government, the balance is about 60-40, with 60 going towards the ideological proclivities of a government, because the government's decisions are often through that particular prism.
I remember in some interviews you mentioned that when you decided to enter politics, several parties approached you, and your choice was based on what spoke to you at an ideological level. But that is when you were just joining at an elective system, we are probably getting questions at a micro system, at an individual level, as a young professional, when we have a chance to contribute, say as a consultant, with a political leader or a minister, or as you know, on volunteer time on the field. Should the ideology of the government factor in there, or just that micro opportunity, if I may use the word, of contributing to public service take precedence at the, and I'm giving the specific context, at the stage we are at?
So at the stage where we just rephrase the last part of that. Sorry, I saw a question coming in on the Q&A that I foolishly typed an answer to. I will now I will stop looking at them and just
No,
listen to you, because you're fielding them very ably. Just repeat the last part of that.
no problem. I'm just saying, at the stage that young professionals are, so between the ages of 25, 35, 40,
Mhm.
when they're at the same time building their professional trajectories, at that time when they have these micro opportunities to contribute on the field, whether through consulting contracts or just direct volunteering, at that time, should the ideologies of the government factor in so much, or just the opportunity of contributing in the limited way that we can?
Again, I would say it depends on what the particular issue is. Exactly the same answer I gave last time. Look, if you are, for example, a professional accounting firm and the government asks you to check the accounts of a particular project, I don't see any problem in you doing that. If you are somebody who does sort of independent analyses of things, and you're asked to conduct some sort of social audit or impact assessment on a particular government project, I don't see a problem doing that. The issue comes up if your opportunities relate to things which you're uncomfortable with conceptually or ideologically. And there can be such things depending on what they ask you to do. Now, where I would draw distinctions, for example, when I was invited by Prime Minister Modi to be one of his initial group of 7 ambassadors, quote unquote, for the Swachh Bharat campaign, I was excoriated by many in my own party and on the left for taking that on, saying that I was basically enabling a reprehensible government to do something. And I disagreed vehemently, saying that I genuinely thought, first of all, this was a policy about politics. Secondly, that Mahatma Gandhi, no less, before independence, had said that sanitation is more important than freedom. So, I mean, that's the extent to which the goal of a clean India has existed in our consciousness, and therefore it's not incompatible with my ideology. And then third, what I did was, in the project that I undertook as my commitment to this role, I made it a point to clean up a particular stretch of seafront, of beach, in a Muslim area, and enlist the local population to join me in cleaning it, so that if at all there was any ideological discomfort on anybody's part, it could have been dispelled by seeing these were young people of the very minority that was perceived as being beleaguered by BJP rule, coming out with the blessings of their local Jamaat. I took care of that as well, and joining a Congress MP in doing something that, after all, they were waking up and looking at the filth outside, they would have a cleaner environment to focus on. So in that kind of thing, I would say you can somehow, you can justify a sort of ideologically neutral intervention, while at the same time address some of the ideological concerns by the manner in which you fulfill your obligations to do this. That kind of thing is always possible. But I would say to young people, judge on the basis of what it is you have an opportunity to do. But obviously, anything that directly involves political support or political enabling of the ruling party, you can only do if you feel comfortable with the beliefs, philosophies, and convictions of that ruling party. Otherwise, you're being untrue to yourself, which is the worst thing any one of us can be, right?
That's a fair response, and very insightful also, that important to kind of really harp on the opportunities that we get, but be very mindful of how it affects our conscience. I want to kind of draw the focus out a little bit at a global stage in view of the recent events without commenting on them. We have some questions coming up on what you think is the changing position of India on the global platform. Um, uh, Not just in the past 1 year, but over nearly the past decade. and if there is anything on those issues that we should be concerned about or optimistic about.
Well, it's a bit frustrating because I take some pride and credit in having been perhaps not perhaps I think almost certainly the first person um, to start talking about the soft power of India way back at the turn of the millennium. And I did so with the blessings of the originator of the concept, Professor Joseph Nye at Harvard. And I really was celebrating the fact that India had managed to brand itself on the world stage as a country with sort of a better story to tell than the ostensibly more successful China, which, despite its GDP growth and so on, had really become a country which was reprehensible in its treatment of minorities and its treatment of various categories of people, its repression, its lack of democracy, its disabling of dissent, etc. And that, to my mind, was something well worth celebrating. Then, as we all know, there's been a bit of a change. And now it does mortify me to see that what was clearly heading India's way as a global narrative, that liberal democracy can take roots and flourish in a quote unquote third world country, in a developing country, that there is no better example of the successful management of vast diversities than a country like India. When all of those narratives are going along so smoothly, we go right on the other side and elect a government that does not see diversity as a strength, but rather bemoans it as a weakness, wishes to deny it, wishes to eradicate it. A government which, by its own conduct or the conduct that it condones, and often it's difficult to tell the difference because they're often done in the name of the same parivar, but the conduct that it condones has earned itself a very, very bad press internationally. I mean, it's sad because, I lived abroad for the longest time. My gosh, apart from being born abroad and moving back to India 2.5, I went to graduate school at the age of 19 and only returned at the age of 51, 52 practically, no, 52 and almost 53. So when I think about it, I spent 34 years nearly in an international environment. And I read wonderful things about the Indian media, except for that very initial period when the emergency was on, when none of us were particularly fond of what was going on in India. Ever since then, India has been treated with absolute affection in the world press. And now to see that you can't pick up a newspaper in a Western democracy without reading something really sad, negative, and unpleasant about our country is a matter of chagrin. And I know because I talk, a number of the international visitors who come through this country often seek me out. Many of them have known me in my previous life as a UN official. And what they have to say about how they perceive India is rather dismaying. And it's troubling too, because many of these are people from countries which genuinely want and value a partnership with India. But they keep telling us, don't make it so difficult for us to be your friends. Don't put us in a position where a partnership with you would be seen as invidious rather than something we can celebrate in the world, because of the bad name India is getting for things like Islamophobia, xenophobia, mistreatment of minorities, stifling of democracy, curbing of autonomous institutions. Now, all of these things, I know that some of you would well be inclined to say, look, this is exaggerated. We live in India, it's not that bad. I always point out, listen, the very fact that I'm able to make the speeches I make and write the articles and books I write shows you that we're still a democracy. There is still space for us to challenge what's going on. But that doesn't negate the fact that it is going on. And that is what, of course, the rest of the world sees and objects to.
I'm hearing there's a lot to be concerned about. At the same time, there's a lot to be optimistic about, and we have our respective spaces to still make a difference. You've spoken at length about some of the things through which we can make a difference, kind of really taking ownership of our respective fields, seizing opportunities without compromising on our conscience, and really being out there and harping and leaning on our strengths. We're almost close to end of this conversation, which I have very much enjoyed. But I do welcome you for your final remarks, Dr. Tharoor, to the audience now, if any. And especially if on the note, because I personally love ending it on the notes of habits, that as you have juggled being a writer, being a politician, being a career official, being an academic, a lot of habits have gone into this. A lot of discipline must have gone into this. What are some of the parting notes on habits and discipline that you can leave us with?
Discipline, there is no escape from. And I think you've discovered that already as undergraduate at Ashoka. Ultimately, all of us are expected to fulfill our own obligations, whether it's writing a paper in our own time, whether it's reading up to be better prepared for a class or a seminar. I mean, once you get to the level of college, you discover whether you're capable of fulfilling your own obligations to yourself and to the responsibilities you've undertaken. It's also a time to discover yourself as a human being, which means exploring extracurricular interests, social habits, all of those things. And I'm not saying you should be a swot or a nerd. You can certainly give yourself the time to enjoy all of those things as well. But ultimately, you have to very quickly decide what is the most important. If getting an A grade in all your papers is your objective, then do what it takes to achieve that first and spend the remaining time on things that give you pleasure. Sometimes there will be more time remaining because you did your work efficiently and well. Sometimes there'll be less time than you thought you would have, and you may have to then make sacrifices. To live is very often to choose. Maybe the movie you were looking forward to going to the opening of, you'll have to put off to another time because this paper, damn it, has to be turned into the professor tomorrow. Maybe a party with friends will have to be skipped because you have obligations to read something, otherwise you can't make a meaningful contribution in class the next day. So that kind of thing, the habit of discipline, of prioritizing, and of developing a sense of responsibility to the important yardsticks and tasks you've set yourself, those are things you acquire at this stage of your life. And I urge you all never to forget how important that is. Secondly, I do believe that one very useful skill is a skill to be able to communicate, which means not just to be a very good intellect, to learn well, read well, understand issues, but be able to share your understanding with others. If you are somebody who doesn't enjoy being on a public stage, I would say two things. First, practice by just having intelligent conversations with friends in which you explain to them the kinds of things that you need to one day to explain to an audience. Second, go ahead and try it. There's no better way than overcoming fear or nervousness or insecurity about things like a public audience than actually addressing them and seeing for yourself what it feels like, what you're good at, what you're bad at, what works with an audience, what doesn't work. Put up with some failures, and that is a third very big point. Almost nobody in the world who has succeeded hasn't known some failure in the past. And so be prepared not to be knocked out by failure. Knocked down, yes, but pick yourself up again and move on. We'll all have failures. And we've already begun this conversation by talking about some of mine. But the important thing is to realize that if you have enough faith in yourself, pick yourself up and keep going on. And the final message, which really applies to people of all ages, but which I never tire of repeating, is the best thing that you can do is never to let yourself down. Know yourself, know what you're capable of, and that you'll only find out by trying, including trying some things and realizing you're not capable of them. Not everybody has the same talents. Not everybody's going to come first in class or score A pluses or win the 100-meter dash or whatever, but every one of us has the capacity to understand how far we can stretch ourselves, and all of us can stretch ourselves beyond where we were yesterday. That's that simple human nature. And once you do that, just be the best you that you can possibly be. Nobody else can be you better than you can be. So if you can focus on being the best you that you can possibly be, the rest will take care of itself. The best version of you is what other people will need to rely on. And that, I think, to my mind, is probably the final word that I would leave you all with. Ultimately, education has never been just about books, about papers, about grades. It's also been about the kind of mind you develop, your ability to cope with the unfamiliar, your ability to handle adversity, to develop resilience, and all of this at the end comes down to getting the best out of yourself. I wish you all great luck in doing that.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. This was the most apt ending you could have given to us as we complete 10 years in an institution that's mission is to help to bring the best out of us. I do want to invite Professor Rudranshu to close this with his remarks, since he's gotten you to be with us. And I really enjoyed this conversation. And I hope the audience loved it as much as I did.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Jason. I hope you enjoyed your work in the PM's office and all of that. Sounds fascinating.
I
Very
did.
good. Good luck in your own next stages of career.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor.